that the sun shines down its power to all the world and makes the wind blow strong as it will. I wonder hope gentle rains can fall upon the land, so lovely earth can stay lovely still. I'm going to welcome everybody to this segment of Energy Week with George Harvey and Tom Fennell. And we have guests today, and we have Carol Levin and Dave Bonta and Ken Azar, who Carol is a wonderful person who is very famous because she just is. and Dave is famous because he's written books and sold Tori her water heater. And Ken is about to launch a new business.
Right.
So this all has to do with USA Solar, and what we're going to do. And by the way, I should introduce Tom Fennell here because he counts too.
I'm the one pushing the button.
He's our on-camera engineer. And so I'm just going to turn this over to Carol, who is allowed to say anything she wants.
Okay. I guess I get to start. And my particular start in Vermont was when I was living in Philadelphia. I'm originally from Pennsylvania, the Pittsburgh area. But I ended up in Philadelphia at some point, and I was working as a physical therapist, which is, as my mother says, my real job because that's what she sent me to college for. But I was in Philadelphia, got involved with the Philadelphia Folk Song Society and became a volunteer and did this, started with stuffing envelopes and then went off and did the information booth at the festival and then became director of the Spring Folk Festival and various other things. And then at some point I decided I wanted to open a coffee house, because this was in the early 70s.
It was coffee house time.
We'll get to energy soon.
Yes. Okay, I will wrap it. Okay, anyway.
I'm not pushing you, Carol.
Okay.
I'm just telling the audience, we will get there.
We will get to energy, yes. Okay, in 5 words or less, I came to Vermont, opened a coffee house in Brattleboro called the Chelsea House Folklore Center. And we operated from Labor Day of 1974 to late winter, early spring of 1981.
Okay.
And at some point or other, I met my husband there. He came to blues concerts and contra dances. And we were married at the Chelsea House Folklore Center in 1979. And so after the Chelsea House closed in 81, and I won't go into all the reasons, but Richard and I decided that solar, he was trained in solar. He was a mechanical engineer, took graduate courses in solid state physics, got his master's at Goddard College in Vermont, and came to Brattleboro because of Richard Blase, who was doing some very early solar projects in Brookline, Vermont. So we got married and decided very early on that solar is what we needed to do. And from when we sold, so from 1979 to when he passed away in 2012, which is about 30 some odd years, we were doing solar, mostly photovoltaics. We did solar hot water a little bit, but it was end of the era where there were the tax credits and the whole solar hot water system sort of faded out. But
could I interrupt just a second,
yes.
Carol? Because I love this. Richard Gottlieb, your husband,
yes,
was among the first people in the world to install solar. And he installed solar on Vanguard satellites, which were the first satellites the U.S. put into orbit.
that is absolutely true.
Now, we're talking about the grandfather and grandmother of solar, all right? This is what we're talking about here. And so if you don't like solar, you can blame her. But if you do like solar, you can fall at her feet and say, we're unworthy.
Yes. In the late 1950s, Richard was putting solar cells, which were about this big, and there were 6 of them on the early Vanguards. The second one that went up, the first one failed on launch. Sputnik went up, and then the second one was really the one that made it and operated until about 15 years ago. And all this time has been sending their signal saying what the temperature is in space. And that was its whole goal, the Vanguard satellite was
Do you
tell
happen
the
to know if
temperature.
the temperature in space changed during
It's getting warmer.
Global warming, no. I
getting colder.
think it did not. Anyway, Richard and I were married in 1979, and by 1980, we were doing mostly solar greenhouses, some solar hot water, and then by 1983, after the first it was the New England Solar Energy Association, which is now the Northeast Sustainable Energy Association, had their first PV conference at MIT, and we were just totally enthralled with the magic of photovoltaics. So yes, we were early adopters, early promoters, because Rich was just so fascinated with the idea of solar electric. And we sold our first panel in 1983 and then proceeded to sell mostly remote homes and off-grid applications, because that's where the market was.
Yeah.
And then probably the last, I don't know, 20 years or 15 or 12 years, or
Grid
the
tie.
whole expansion to grid tie systems has come along, and that's the bulk of what's going on now. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2012.
a great loss.
Thank you.
Really, I have never met anybody who had anything bad to say about Richard Gottlieb. I've met a lot of people who had a lot of good things to say about him.
And he did a lot of teaching. He was very committed to teaching, and we had our one-day Saturday workshops for years at the shop, and then he got involved with Greenfield Community College, Ulster Bosse's in New York State, and NESE, which is now in Greenfield, the Northeast Sustainable Energy Association. He taught for a bunch of people in the Boston area, and so we figured at some point that he had, as students, as individual students, not counting the ones that took more than one class, but over somewhere between 600 and 700 students over the period
Wow.
of
That's a
time.
lot of influence.
And he was just one of the most delightful people I've ever known, really.
He loved it. He absolutely loved it. And I did slip a solar cell in his casket
Oh, you did, eh? Oh, why?
because I thought he'd like to have it with him on his next journey.
You heard it here first, folks.
Okay, so in 1981, I closed the Chelsea House because we just weren't making it, and Geordie Harold in Northampton opened the Iron Horse Club, which he had a lot of the same people we did. And we had gotten originally about half our audience from the Northampton Amherst area, and then Geordie was open. So I don't blame him for it, because it was just a matter of time. We knew that was going to happen. But anyway, so 30 some odd years later, in the meantime, we had met Dave at various places, and Dave, I don't know, did you go to any of Rich's classes?
No,
No.
but I had interfaced with Richard a number of times. We were friendly competitors, and Richard used to teach the Solar Fest course with John Blittersdorf, who's a good friend of mine. And I just had an awesome regard and respect for the man.
I think that's understandable.
The last, my work with Richard had to do with pulling together his educational component for what we were trying to do in Bellows Falls on the Green Island. And I asked Richard if he would become the dean of our School for Sustainability. And part of the project that we were working on, right up until the day before Richard died, which just goes to show you how dedicated he was using the hydropower from the Stuart Reed's building and a large incubator made from an old mill building. We were going to begin a school where people could learn the basics of building solar panels. And And this took Richard right back to his roots, and he was very excited to work on the project.
Now, I have to ask you, what do you mean by building solar panels?
I mean the ingot producing machines
Okay.
that he was able to get used. I believe
Wow.
he was going to get them from Westinghouse. And these things were not about trying to compete with any real full-scale manufacturing, but they were about trying to show people that they could build things like this from renewable energy, hydropower, renewable energy, making renewable energy.
Right.
It just seemed like almost one of those perpetual motion machines. We're going to use renewable energy to make more.
You have to use some energy to make solar.
Right, and it's very energy intensive.
Yeah.
And so what we thought was, well, even though these are older machines, they're almost scrap, and we may be able to get them for a lot, not a lot, and just show people how it's done so that it could be part of our course in photovoltaics and total sustainability. And it would not be a bad idea to have a production facility to make solar panels.
At this time, you weren't able to go walk into a store and walk out with a solar panel under your arm.
Well, actually, no, this was when Richard, this was just in 2012.
Okay, this
Yeah,
is
this
more,
was-
more
this is
recently.
very-
We'd still like to be able to do this, but Richard and I were working together to see that
Okay.
vision made.
Mhm.
And solar cells are actually made out of sand.
Yeah.
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 So-
Very expensive.
Highly refined
sand.
sand.
Highly refined sand.
Yeah.
But the resource is there.
Yeah.
So after Richard passed, I stayed in touch with Carol, and I asked her at some point, what is the disposition of Sunnyside? And she said, I don't think I can keep it going alone. And that just bothered me a lot, because thinking back on Richard and Carol's legacy, all of the people that they had helped to bring into the business, myself included, by paving the way, by clearing the path, so that all the rest of us could come into the business on their shoulders. It just seemed to me to be somehow unfair that Carol and Richard weren't going to receive any kind of a reward from the industry that they helped to birth, at least in our area. So I was doubly impressed by the number of people that showed up at Richard's service. It was everybody who's anybody in solar. Stephen Strong, Jeff Wolf, they were all there.
Yeah.
The place was packed beyond, it couldn't hold everybody. There was a
Yeah.
line outside.
Yeah.
Everybody wanted to come and give tribute. And I thought to myself, that's an honor to have even been around people like this. Now, how do we leave it? Do we just say, oh, nice job, and walk away? Or do we try to find some way to help? And because I do solar stores, I asked Carol if she might be thinking of keeping the business going in some capacity, and we talked from there.
And what happened?
Well, this is the most interesting thing. The model that I use is really about low overhead, because ever since 2008, and probably before, most people have just been really challenged to come up with the ways and means to keep their lives going. Most regular people, the 99%, I'll say.
Yes.
And so I said to Carol, well, let's try to put something together that doesn't cost us a lot of money. Because the one thing that can kill any business is big overhead. So I asked her where she thought we might be able to set up shop. And she suggested that we look around the area. And one of the sites that she thought we might be able to talk to was the barn where she had originally had the Chelsea House Folk Life Center.
Which at this point was being used by Todd Darrow, who has the Chelsea Royal Diner, which is on the same property. And he was using it for storage.
So, just so everybody's clear on this, most people in Brattleboro know where the Chelsea Royal Diner is.
Yeah.
You go out on Route 9, and when you come to the Chelsea Royal Diner, you go a few feet farther, and there's a driveway that goes to the right, and you go in there, and interesting sound.
Voila.
And there it
Well,
is.
that's a phone.
So,
That's
You
a
go in
background.
there, and the solar store is right in that little barn, which has,
Right.
Big barn.
as I recall, chickens running around.
Yeah, the chickens come in and go. It's quite organic experience as you get
And
the
there's
full
a dog
permaculture
house that
thing.
has a solar panel on it. This is a very funny
Oh, there's a
thing.
phone
There's a
there.
phone there.
Just come on over and don't be shy.
Grab it right
Everything will
there.
be fine. Okay.
That's great.
That's little music.
Somebody's trying to call in from the studio audience here.
Maybe that's possible. We aren't live, so whoever it is psychic.
It might be our landlord asking for our rent. Today is the first, you know?
Okay, so let's go on about the USA Solar.
Sure. The whole thing was we were able to use the barn that she had been in before. And of course, a barn is hard to heat and to power. It was just too large of a ceiling. So we pulled together a few bucks. We asked the community to help us, Co-op Power and others. We said, can you help us find a little money? And we created this an investment bond so that they could put in, get a small return back, have discounts to their membership if they would support the store. We came up with every creative thing we could come up with in order to get that business open, and to create a fund to do the remediation and whatever weatherization we could to try to keep the barn warm. So we have a pellet stove in there, and we have about an 800 square foot space. And then once we had that secured, I was able to bring in a whole lot of solar demos and gear, and to open up a full-blown store.
Why don't you just say what your USA Solar Stores is?
Sure. USA Solar Stores was a concept that I came up with in 2001 to create community-based solar outposts, I call them at
Okay,
first.
now I want to stop you for just a second, and I want to point out that Dave Bonta created the USA Solar Stores. So if you don't like USA Solar Stores, you can blame him. This is a great concept, a really great concept, the community-based solar store.
My thought was, if all the lights go out for whatever reason,
Yeah,
and this was back after 9/11,
yeah,
I thought this isn't something that we can take lightly. This isn't, the idea of energy being on a grid, the idea of all of our support systems being reliable is no longer something that I felt we should take for granted.
Are you aware, Dave, of the things that came out of NASA and FERC about 3 weeks ago, a month ago?
Oh, no.
Yeah, FERC was saying that if terrorists attacked successfully 8 targets in the United States, basically unprotected targets. One was a factory. The other 3 were they were transmission stations.
Transmission. Yeah, transmission
It
stations.
could take
or
the entire U.S. grid
substations.
down for a year. And the other one from NASA said that if we had been off by 6 days in our orbit, I think in 2012, we would have been hit by a coronal ejection mass that would have taken down the U.S. grid for a year to 4 years. This is a very serious problem.
It really happened. It just missed us by a whisker.
Yeah.
Well, that was one thought prompt for the store. I wanted to have a place that no matter what happened, the lights would still be on.
Right.
That people could find it. And these days, more than ever, you need your communications, you need your emergency systems, you need
Yes.
some sort of a resilient plan.
Resilience.
So the idea was to, okay, at least have an outpost, and if we opened it up as a store, people that are interested in solar but might have been intimidated from learning more about it might come in and just ask the simple question, well, what is solar energy? How can I use it in my home?
Right.
And I wanted to do that in a storefront because, as we all know, you can go into a store, a shirt store, shoe store, try something out, and if you don't like it, you put it back, and
Yes.
nobody hassles you.
Yes.
And unlike other types of venues, I thought, well, solar needs to have such a place because it's new technology, there's a learning curve, people need to have a place that's comfortable, where they can take the time to get the straight answers with no expectations that they're going to purchase anything. And my thought was, if we offer that service, we might actually create a relationship with a person who might come to us and say, I want to buy a Marathon water heater or whatever it is they need for energy.
Yeah.
So that was the
This,
idea.
by the way, is Dave sold my landlady the Marathon water heater that I use in my apartment. So this is, this goes back to
2003,
it might have been, yeah. I think it was 2004.
Yeah.
It was just about the time, so it was 10 years ago. And that was before you started the solar store thing.
Well, we offered a lot of products that nobody else had. We were always looking for what's next, what's new. And we didn't have to look too hard, because the people that come into our stores, folks like you and Tom, would tell us, this is what I'm looking for. We were the first storefront to offer biodiesel, for example, because a fellow that lived in Marlboro said, "Can you get me biodiesel?" I said, "Sure. What is it?"
How's it work?
And then I learned all about biodiesel, and then after a while we were ordering it by the 55-gallon drum, and then pretty soon we were ordering it by the tanker car, and I had the pleasure of being the first person to sign a contract with the state of Vermont to get the Department of Transportation to use biodiesel.
So, folks, if you don't like biodiesel,
It might be.
And interestingly enough, I was on the school board in Guilford for a while, and Dave did come down and do a presentation
Yeah.
to the school board.
Features and
this
benefits
is thrilling
of
to me
biodiesel.
to see. Here we are in Brattleboro, which is still a town, as much as it feels like a city, except to visitors.
It's like Siberia to some visitors.
Yeah, right. And we've got great people who are of historic consequence living amongst us, and I think that certainly Richard Gottlieb was one of those, and Carol is one of those, and Dave is one of those. Thank you.
Thank
But
you.
let's continue.
Okay, so you made a bunch of stores all over
Yeah,
the
so
place.
at some point somebody walks in and says, "This is a great business model. I'd like to have one of my own."
Yeah.
And we opened one in Manchester, and then we opened another one in Greenfield, and then we began to open them up in New Hampshire and New York, and the next thing you know, if somebody from California wants to open one, and I'm on the train, because especially after 9/11 I wasn't too keen on flying, but I thought the train was a better choice. So I'm crisscrossing around the country on the old train lines,
Yeah.
the old famous Santa Fe and all these things.
That's an adventure.
It's lovely.
It
It's
is.
great, and it's a great way to travel. I advocate trains, and I hope that our country puts more support
I have a
into
feeling
it.
we will, but yeah.
Anyhow, so all around the country, opening these things up, which brings me to somewhere in the neighborhood of 39, 40 stores opened
Wow.
over the last 12 years.
Wow.
Now, not all of them are still open,
Oh.
because after 2008 there was a major economic crash, and
Yes.
there are 4 reasons why businesses will fail, and at least my businesses fail.
Yeah.
If any 2 of them remain constant, such as a long-going economic slump, such as what we've had, or any other some other reasons, not enough money in or too much overhead or whatever, then a business will fail, and a number of them did. But still, the model's pushing forward, and still we're getting people interested in opening up these community-based solar stores all over the country.
Yeah.
And one of such people was Ken.
Is Ken.
And Ken's from Sarasota,
Okay.
and he contacted me last year.
Last year.
Yeah.
Last year I started talking to you.
Now, how did you find out about the solar USA
It
solar
was,
stores?
believe it or not, I was just going through on the website, and I was looking up solar because I started getting involved in solar. I used to go back a little bit. Back in 2004, I was building a SIP type of construction,
Okay.
structurally panel homes, and
Okay.
I wanted, with the very energy efficient home, I wanted to kind of get solar involved in it.
Yes.
Well, down in Sarasota, no one even talks about solar or even knows anything about it. So, I didn't really go anywhere, but I said, well, you got to find an electrical engineer to help you with this and all that. But meanwhile, we kept building, and then, of course, in 06, everything collapsed and fell apart. Well, I was looking for something about 2 years ago that I wanted to start a business that was going to kind of grow in the next 20 years. Okay, PV systems in Florida, no one really knows anything about it. They don't even know where to go and ask for it. They don't know anything. So I was like, it'd be neat to have a store that somebody could come in and put their hands on some and ask questions about it and get educated about it. And maybe down the road they'll come into a customer and buy it. Well, I just happened to be going through the internet and saw USA Solar Store. And I said, that's a perfect concept. That's exactly what I'm looking for. Why do I want to recreate the wheel? Somebody's already done it. And so I contacted Dave, and we talked on and off for over a year, until I got ready to say, okay, I went to schooling, I got some background in solar that I did, because at that time I didn't know anything other than generate energy, but I didn't know how it did it. And
He's got his NAPSEP.
I went through NAPSET training and figured out a way to, okay, I really want to do this. I really want to do this, and kept trying to, come to it. And finally we got to the point where, okay, we're ready to go. And so I came up and go through the training and learn more things I can put down in the Sarasota. Our biggest thing is not heat. We don't need heat. We got plenty of heat down there. And so basically it's PVs, showing people, educate them how they can start putting it on their homes to create power and to get off the grid if they need to be.
Now, people in Florida are accustomed to problems developing like hurricanes.
Right, and
That's the first thing we talked
That's
about.
one of the things we're going to do. Is I'm looking at a system that's a mobile system, like a backup generator, but it's strictly solar and wind, because biggest problem we have during a hurricane is you can't get fuel. Everything shuts down.
Right.
So I've talked to Dave about, okay, let's see if we can get a system that I can have a portable system that these people can pull out. Biggest thing with hurricanes, you get a lot of flooding, we lose power. It could be 3 or 4 days before you even see any support from government or anything. So you got to be able to at least run maybe a refrigerator, some fans, a little bit of lighting, but nothing major, but you can survive. So that's one of the concepts I'm bringing down in there and looking at, okay, how can we create a fairly inexpensive system that people can at least somewhat be comfortable during after a storm. So that's one concept we've been looking at down there. But it's mainly I want to educate people down. I want to be able to have a place for people to come in, put their hands on stuff, ask questions, learn about PV. Because really, there's PV companies down there, but you never hear about them. You never see them. There's nothing talked about energy using photovoltaic. It's just no one really talks about it. There's plenty of water heater systems, but
That's interesting to me because there's a lot of sunshine in Florida.
It's the Sunshine State.
it's hot. There's no other word.
Here we are in Vermont, and I'm reading about big PV systems going up in Scotland, which is I don't know how much farther north than we are, but there's no part of Germany
Right.
that isn't north of the northernmost part of Vermont, and
Right.
there's no part of Scotland that isn't north of the northernmost part of Germany. So it's pretty far,
Well, that's
But
I
they've
was
got
thinking,
big PV systems up there going up.
I think if we get out there and start talking to people and they start realizing, this is a thing down here, we have a perfect opportunity. We do have sun, 5 to 6 hours a day. We can actually pull good, strong energy
Now,
from.
Another thing I'd like to ask, in Vermont today, the cheapest way a person can get electrical power for a lot of people is to get solar. And people don't know that. They think of solar as being expensive,
Right.
and it turns out it's the cheapest thing around.
There's 3 prejudices against solar which have delayed the rapid acceptance of it and the rapid deployment. And it's kind of an entropic thing where somebody says, well, if solar's so good, how come it's not everywhere?
Yes.
How come John doesn't have it? If John's a cheapskate. If he was to have it, I'd have it too.
Yeah.
So you have this inertia that has to be broken through. But then you also have what I call the prejudice of the price being generated by, it sounds kind of wacky, but it's generated by our media, and it's not a direct way. It's sort of a reverse messaging where somebody might come out on the news and say, flash, new technology has just been announced that promises to make solar affordable and reliable and very soon. This has been 30 years you've had that news conference coming out.
Yeah.
Right.
So what people assume is it is not affordable now, it is not reliable now, we have to wait.
It's been way more affordable the last couple of years because, even 5 years ago, what cost maybe $10,000 is going to cost $4,000 now.
Yes.
Oh, it's
Right.
crazy low.
And it's, what is it, Sunshot Initiative? They're talking about bringing the price of solar down below $1 a watt.
Yeah.
And when I look at news reports that are coming along about new technologies with solar that are coming out in the next few years, I'm thinking, they're going to achieve that. They're actually going to get below $1 a watt.
Oh, absolutely.
Which means that people are going to be able to cut their electric bills, not just a little bit, which they can do today by going to solar. They could cut their electric bills by huge amounts by going to solar in a few years, which is not to say that there isn't a good reason to do it now.
Right.
But there are a bunch of good reasons. I have some questions about the new technology. IBM, for example, has a printable technology. And printable technology, when I think about that being compared to silicon, well, silicon is glass. And how long does glass last? You go to Europe and you're going to see stained glass windows that were put in 1,000
It
years
can last
ago.
forever if it's not
Yeah.
broken.
And in fact, solar can last
Right.
darn near
We have-
forever.
Yes, it was interesting because when we first got in, they were guaranteeing the panels for 10 years because that's how long the terrestrial use was. And
Yes.
then it went to 15 years because we got to that point.
Mm-hmm.
And then we got to near 20, but SolarX had been building solar panels for 25 years almost, so because they were going to have their 25th anniversary. So they bumped it to 25 years. And everybody jumped on the 25-year bandwagon, and now it's eking up to 40 years.
Yes.
Just because that's what terrestrial photovoltaics have done. And in the early days, the warranty things had to do with all the solder points were done by hand.
Yes.
Now everything's done by robotics,
Right.
and you really don't have any, except for amorphous, the single and multi-crystal or polycrystal technologies, they're going to last a very long time, and we just keep gaining the years with experience because we're seeing even 40-year panels that are working
Well,
just fine.
I mentioned before the show started that I had seen in 2011 a town in France had done an audit of of the solar panels that they had put in that provided them with all of their power in 1991. People don't think of this as being something that's even imaginable, but they did that, and they found that those panels were delivering. My recollection was 93%, but I might be.
If anybody wants to go see the Solar Smithsonian, head up to Charlie Hall's. Is it Bradford or?
No, he's in Topsham.
Topsham,
West
right, the Barrel
Topsham.
Man. And he's got every generation, I think he's got every generation of solar technology as it was introduced. He bought it. So he's got these old quad lamps up there, and they're bronze from just being baked, and they've got, it looks like somebody punched them or something, but still, they're
still working.
producing electricity.
Yes.
And he's got them hooked up to this big plastic barrel man that sits there and holding lanterns that come on at night from the power of those things. It's like Disney World on solar. It's a great tour, and he's open to anybody coming up and learning about solar.
Well, there's a lot that people don't know, and some of the stuff that I see in the news is just astonishing to me. I came across one this morning in which they were talking about a number of misconceptions, and one of those misconceptions dealt with the toxic emissions that came from solar panels.
Yeah.
Oh, you gotta watch out for that.
Well, what they were saying was there's gallium arsenide
Oh my God.
in there, and when the
Not
panels,
in all of them. That's one of the new technologies.
six technology.
But even so, it's embedded in glass.
Yes.
And if the
Not
glass breaks,
Right.
it can leach out. And if your solar panel is put into a landfill, that theoretically could happen. I'm not sure that it would make a landfill any worse.
I
than
don't
it
know that
already is.
anybody's ever put a solar panel
Yeah.
in a
Well,
landfill,
you know,
except
this
to put on the landfill to produce power.
Right. But the person, the guy who's writing the article was smart enough to go and find out what happens to old solar panels. And what he found out was that they get recycled.
Yeah.
They're getting recycled.
Yeah.
Gallium arsenide is not cheap, and some of the other stuff that's been used in solar panels is also not cheap.
This brings us to another point about our store, going full circle.
Right.
There is old technology out there. The solar panels still are working. They may not be the highest voltage or the latest technology, but they still produce something.
Yeah.
And so as people are upgrading, we're finding a market in used equipment.
Yes.
So one of the things that we have in our store is a consignment corner. And,
Wow.
and
Okay.
since that got out, people are starting to contact us and bringing in their old inverters, their older charge controllers, their older sine wave or modified square wave equipment. They're bringing in their older modules
Yeah.
because the real estate that those modules used to take up used to be maybe 500 watts for an entire roof. But now for that same roof space, you can get 3 or 4 kilowatts on there. So they're bringing in these older equipment, which is great for us because it's creating a market for the beginner. For the person that just has a
who
cabin.
in this particular environment is very likely to be some young person who's living off grid.
Exactly. So we're seeing people coming in. I have a guy coming in today, which is why I have to get back to the store. He's coming in to buy a used Trace inverter charger, a used C40, all the old breaker disconnects, some wire, the whole package, $300.
All of which is not going to a landfill.
Right. This is going to be recycled into more use.
And one of the advantages you have of setting up in Florida is for every panel, you can make 50% more on your panels than we can in ours over the length of the year.
Right.
Say that again?
Right.
Right. Florida gets more sunshine.
We get more
Okay.
sunshine.
For a longer calendar year.
Longer calendar
Absolutely,
year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But in Vermont, the solar panels have even so a short payoff period.
We use them all year round at my house.
No, what I'm saying is,
payoff.
if you
Payoff.
if you
Payoff?
buy
Sure.
a panel and if you buy a setup,
Yeah.
if you go into community solar or you put it on your own roof or your backyard, if you borrow the money to do that, typically what happens is you reduce your bill for electricity right off the bat.
Right.
It's you save money immediately. The
Right.
only thing that you've lost is the fact that you've made a commitment.
Right.
And there's a payback period, and it's. Do you happen to know what it is?
It's getting shorter.
It's getting
and
shorter and shorter, 4 or 5 years now.
Okay, so if you borrow money for 4 or 5 years, it's
60 payments, less than your
Yep,
electric
and it's
bill.
done.
right, and you're
Game
done.
over.
And
Done.
then what
Game over.
happens
It's
for the
over.
next 90 years is
Free
you don't
free
pay-
energy for as long as that sun is shining.
Right.
Right.
You whistle as you walk by
Yes.
the bank.
Yeah.
Right.
That's right.
That's some of the
And
concepts.
this is something that
Yeah.
I mean, these are things that from historic empirical data, we can think that if I were to invest in solar today, before I died, it would be paid off, and I would be without an electric bill, and I could leave that stuff to my grandchildren,
sure.
who would possibly be able to use them for most of or all of their lives.
Definitely.
This is like building a castle.
Yeah.
You know, where this
Right.
is a long-lasting structure.
And it's just in time. We all need a break. I often,
I thought you were going to say something.
no, I
about
often
global
thought,
warming.
the people that were buying solar for the longest time are those that need it at least.
Yeah,
It's
well,
the little guy, the 99% that really needs this.
yes.
It reminds me of the Dickens story when they were talking to Scrooge, and as one of these, he says, "Why are you lavishing so much attention on these poor people?" It's because they need it
Yeah,
the most.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think that's really where solar is the great equalizer.
And who said this in the Dickens story?
Oh, I
Was
think it was one of the ghosts of Christmas past
Oh,
or
I
something
see.
like that. Somebody like that.
I think at the end of the story, Scrooge was saying that.
Yeah,
Which
yeah.
is, I suspect, what's going to happen in our society.
The other thing you might want to be prepared for. I mean, we've had an influx this year, this spring, of young kids coming in with parents
All right.
because they're like 5th and 6th graders. They're all working on these science projects.
That's
and
right.
Every kid wants to do
A
solar
solar,
project.
Little
Yeah.
solar project. Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
Yeah, they're coming up with this knowledge.
that's
It's
solar.
it's not new stuff for them.
Right.
Right, they're growing into it. They're
Yeah.
being born into
And
it.
that's what
Yeah.
Dave and me talked about, I think it was yesterday, about maybe going to some of the schools and talking to them, because talking to the kids and everything, might talk to the parents and get them in the stores and get them looking at it and thinking about this.
I actually had a solar radio before there was any such thing.
Oh, we have solar clotheslines.
Solar close.
No, really
old
did.
days, that's
Oh, solar dryers,
Right.
which are basically clotheslines. That's old technology.
That's
Yeah.
old tech. I bet that goes back
I
to
think the
Egypt or
other thing
something.
that we need to talk about is this is also something of a fix for our economy.
Yes.
Not only
Yes.
does it lower the
Well-
cost of living for creature comforts, but it also represents a terrific jobs opportunity.
Well, not
across the
just a
country.
jobs opportunity, but one of the things I've been pushing is community power, where every community has its own microgrid or
Yeah.
multiple microgrids, and if that happens, Brattleboro, for example, is shipping out $24 million a year for electricity from Brattleboro.
Wow.
Just Brattleboro, $24 million a year. And that means $2,000 per person per year. It's not just the homes here. This is the businesses and the
Everything.
factories and the
That's a lot of export
municipalities.
dollars.
It's just a lot of export dollars going out. And what we're living through right now is a time when the cheapest source of heat is
No heat.
I found that out. But the cheapest source of heat is heat pumps, which are operated by electricity.
Right.
We are shipping more than $24 million a year out of Brattleboro for fuel for heat, and that means that if we put in the investment to get our electricity and our heat through heat pumps together, we could stop $50 million a year from leaving this community, which is not a city.
Right.
It's a town with a population of 12,000. And what would that do to our economy? Well, it would create $50 million a year worth of jobs.
Right.
Right.
And it would create $50 million worth a year of subsidiary taxes. And it would create side benefits in the economy. You know, if you've got excess electricity, like we have in the United States, particularly in the Midwest, where power prices go negative at night,
Right.
you can take that excess power, you can use it to make hydrogen, you can use the hydrogen to make something else.
Right.
We're in this is a new world we're going into here. This is a new world, and what people have to do is wrap their brains around that, because we cannot rely on fossil fuels. But I've broken into your time.
Well, that's fine. Keep going. You know, when you talk about another benefit of the plan that you were talking about, there's the resiliency benefit.
Resiliency is very important.
And as we move into more, we'll say, less secure types of weather events, it's just nice to know you've got your own little microgrid community,
That's right.
rather than everybody being wiped out. And there's so many costs to that.
Oh,
Plus
yeah.
the disadvantages and the inconvenience of not being able to eat or have water.
Yeah, it is inconvenient.
It's
to
totally
not to have heat or food.
It is.
The nice part about all of this is it's happening
Right.
almost automatically. It is just morphing in that direction, because ultimately it's the most sensible way to go.
Right. It
Right.
doesn't rely
Right,
on a
it is.
government plan. It doesn't rely
Nobody's
on a
telling you
bunch
gotta
of
do it.
studies
Right.
and people being paid to do these studies.
Yeah.
It's really an organic grassroots effort
Right.
based on common sense.
And it's happening at the grassroots level, which means that even like in Australia, where the government backed big business and said we need to go after coal, we need to go after the jobs associated with coal, and what's happening in Australia is the solar panels keep going on, even though they're not subsidized.
Right.
They're still going on. And again, today I was reading about a company which is going to be using Australia as its test bed for putting in not just solar, but for storage that goes with it, and so forth, in order to see how that's going to work in an area where people have very high electric prices, and the government is not helping at all, and is being as discouraging as it possibly can. And they believe they're going to see a transition in Australia just continue to go, because it's coming from the ground up. It's benefiting the 99%. And the 1% can fight it, but it's like
They're fighting the tide of
the
history.
tide. That's right.
Well, all of these technologies are emerging.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, they really are.
Yep.
And as you have already said, it's real grassroots.
I compare it to the computer revolution in the early 80s.
So do I.
It was very similar. We didn't have laptop technologies or any of this. We had Univac, and so we can compare early adapters and the expenses of that, and then a little more adaptation by our cities and towns and people, and then next thing you know, overnight, seemingly, everybody has computers.
Right. And I went through that entire thing. I was am still a computer engineer doing software. My first exposure to a computer was a machine that occupied what had been an apartment. It cost $1.5 million used. It had 10 kilobytes of storage.
Wow.
It had no disk drives. It had no keyboard. It had no monitor. You put in punch cards, or there was a keyboard for the punch cards if you knew how to use it. You put in punch cards, you ran the program, and the output came out on a printer. And that thing cost $170 per minute to run. If you
Yeah.
put the costs and said, how many minutes are we running? How much does it cost? That's the cost. And that machine was the second computer ever to be put into a liberal arts college in the United States. That was a long time ago.
Flash forward, how many
Flash
years?
forward, to now. I mean, my first computer cost me $1,000. That was in 1981, and it was more powerful than that thing that I had when I was in college.
And this here, how many gigabytes?
Yeah, but the problem is, these things here, they're 10,000 times as fast. They're 10,000 times as big in terms of the amount of memory. They have 10,000 times as much storage, and they use about a 10,000th of the amount of power. And there's one thing that these machines cannot do that my first computer could do, and that's keep up with my typing.
Well, when you look at the young generation today, they grew up with this.
Yes, that's
And I
right.
think the young generation starting now is growing up with
That's
solar.
what they're doing. And what I tell people is that I think that solar today is at about the stage that the IBM PC was when it first came out. The initial work had already been done. The prototype work had been done. The first PCs had come out. People were getting accustomed to the fact that this could be done.
Right.
In 1981, I read an article, this was just before the PC came out, that said if the price of transportation had gone the same way that the price of computers had, in terms of speed, in terms of power, the fuel that was used, in terms of cost, you would be able to buy a Boeing 747 for $8 and fly it around the world in half an hour on a gallon of fuel.
But you have to wonder about that. The computer generation was built on entrepreneurs out of their garages.
That's right.
With
That's absolutely
no
right.
money to
No
spend.
money.
That's right.
And they managed to work from bootstraps.
That's right.
But when you get into automobiles and transportation, you have vested interests
You sure do.
that are very much like, well, we'll introduce this when we see a market. And it's just a sort of a slower, clumsier
what
process.
we have to do is say we need two things. One is bicycles and the other's trains for mass transit. But the computers, you'll notice, what are the big businesses in the computer industry? Microsoft, Apple, but everybody else is still kind of marginally big at the biggest.
They control everything.
And the industry is still very much made up of, this is not like the automobile industry, which was dominated by a few manufacturers as time went on.
Now look at the automobile industry in 1910.
Yeah, but the computer industry is, I think, and the solar industry is very much like the computer industry. Look at this thing and look at that thing that existed in 1981 when you could buy a 747 for $8 and fly it around the world in half an hour. This thing here is as much advanced from that as the solar, the difference will be the same in renewable power in 20 or
If we
30
try
years.
to vision the world 20 years from now,
Yeah.
solar will become ubiquitous. Solar will be building integrated.
Right.
Our cars will power our homes when
That's
they're not
right.
taking us around. We may not even be driving our cars. They
think-
may be
yeah.
driving
Driving
us.
themselves.
Yeah, that's right.
This is where all of this is going.
Yeah.
And you won't go very far.
And it's,
You'll work
it's
from
a
home.
Very
a lot
different
of things
world.
will be there.
I
It'll be
already
different
work from home. It's,
Now, two solar things that I just want to mention. One is that the federal government in the U.S. does still have a tax rebate program of 30% for wind, solar, and hydro.
does that include used equipment?
I don't know. I don't.
That
I'm just
is a
wondering about the used equipment that you're selling.
We'll have to check with an accountant.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about the government program is some things that you wouldn't think are qualified are.
Yeah.
Off-grid systems, for example. You
Okay.
can't get a rebate in Vermont, an
Is it?
incentive for off-grid now, but you can still get a federal tax
tax
credit.
Right. I have a friend, by the way, who has I think it's a 4 kilowatt system with enough storage that she just doesn't turn on her backup.
That's
Yeah.
us too.
And the reason she put that in, I think 5 years ago, was because it was cheaper
Than
even in
bringing
those
line
days,
power.
than
Yeah,
than
bringing
grid
in
power
line.
because a lot of places grid power is just horribly expensive.
Here's an interesting focus for all you real estate property developer, property sellers out there. If your property is far from the grid and you sell it for less, then the difference might be less than what it costs to put a renewable energy system into that property.
You know what I'm thinking here is people who are developers can develop property in places where there's large grid. I mean, you could put in you could put in a housing development,
A village.
Right.
a village in
With
a
your
place
own grid.
with your own. But I'm
Right.
thinking a developer could say,
Absolutely.
"You're going to have your own system here."
Well, when I lived
Now-
in Branford, we had and that was a long time ago, but when I lived in Connecticut, we had 150 residents and 49 units on 10 acres.
Okay.
And we all seemed to get along okay.
Yeah.
And it seemed to me, well, in Vermont, we have a little more room than that. And
Yes.
cluster housing is something that's being encouraged
Yes.
for development.
Yes.
So your point that a village might be built with maybe 8 or 10 units, with all of its needs, all of its electricity,
Integrated.
all of its and that's where you see huge economies of scale.
Yes.
At that point.
Okay.
At that point, because if one solar efficient home is good, 8 is better.
Yeah.
Because there are things that can be shared: the
And-
lawn
and-
equipment, the facilities,
Yeah,
the
and
amenities.
In Greenfield, there is a Solar Way, a Wisdom Way. There is, and that's past the fairground in Greenfield. There is a whole development that has, every unit has solar electric and solar hot water.
Wow.
This is where it
Now-
gets very cool. As we get older, we're going to be looking for us baby boomers are going to be looking for a lifestyle which is more social, which is more healthy.
Yes.
And what better place than a little independent village, which has its own food needs met, it's all of the amenities and care facilities required for a small group of folks, and all of its power needs.
And I think that's really where we're headed with our society. But Carol, you had 2 things that you wanted to bring
The
up.
second thing is, I just wanted to remind everybody that the town did agree that when Stanley is going to build a 2.5 megawatt system between Putney Road and the interstate. And that's coming online sooner than later.
Probably this summer.
This summer, I think it's going to start.
And it looks like we're probably going to have 5 megawatts coming up at the landfill.
Okay.
Good.
That's
Well,
great.
The state
it's new state law.
legislation permits it.
Yeah.
They gave an exception to the law, and we can put 5, and if we can, we will.
Yep.
And that's just for the Brattleboro. It's not Brattleboro's landfill.
It's the Wyndham Southeast
Wyndham
Solid
Regional
Waste.
Solid Waste
Management.
District. Yeah, and that's which means that I don't know. There's
About 12 towns.
12 towns that are involved in
Yeah.
that.
Well, we've still got a hole to fill when Yankee comes out.
Yep.
About 30%.
Right.
So from conservation, efficiency, curtailment, which means doing without
Yeah.
if you don't really need electricity.
Right.
We're doing all these things, then adding a little bit of solar where we can.
Right.
We might just fill that hole.
Well, I was interested to see in the news in the last couple of days that the DOE estimates that the United States has 65 gigawatts of hydro that it could develop, and 400 megawatts of that is in Vermont. And this has a capacity factor of 65%, which means that we could replace all of the power that we ever got from Vermont Yankee
Great.
with hydro, which we're not going to do, but
It's nice to know that we
It's
could.
nice to know that we could.
That
If-
resource is there.
If a number of the towns along the Connecticut River didn't sell their power stations to Canada.
Well, what they're talking about is what they call stream reach. And I'm not sure exactly what that means, but I believe that they're talking about smaller streams like the Whetstone and places like that. And the other thing, of course, is that people should know the DOE has said that we could get, I don't know, it's something like 65% of our power from hydro. We could get 18% or something from biomass. We could get 135% of the power we need from wind. We can get almost 1,000% of what we need from PVs. And we could get close to what we need with PVs that are mounted on existing rooftops.
Right.
And we haven't
Like
even
Hannah-
talked about the big
like
negawatt
Yeah.
using less.
Up on the
That's
screen
right.
is exactly that report.
Okay.
And the dark green, of course, is the best potential For
hydro?
All of this is hydro, just
Hydro.
hydro.
Just hydro.
And it's
You'll notice that there's
You know,
a lot of hydro available.
What's
in
Tom?
Vermont.
What's interesting, Tom, is we see the impacts of climate change, and you see unpredictable bursts of wind coming through.
Yes.
And if you had some small wind generators, even house size, taking advantage of that is grid tied feeders.
that isn't even starting yet.
No, we haven't even looked at that yet. But also,
Little
you're going to see
vertical
what it-
axis turbines that sit in your front yard.
right,
like the
and they're
Christmas
feeding
tree.
the grid when the solar is down.
Yeah.
What's the matter with that? Then you also have potential for more water because you're going to have more water coming down. I don't know if you're from Florida. I know you heard about what's happening down there in the Panhandle. There's
Right.
there's 2 feet of water in 20
Flooding,
hours or something.
Unbelievable.
Flooding bad right now.
Unbelievable.
At
There's
some
an
point, we're
interesting
going to have this.
takeaway in this map here. I'll read just the last sentence. Hydropower currently accounts for around 7% of total U.S. electricity generation. The new Stream Reach report, which is what you just mentioned, builds on a 2012 Department of Energy study that identified 12 gigawatts of capacity at existing 80,000 existing non-powered dams in the United States. The dams are there already. They're
Right,
just
right.
not
They
using.
haven't had turbines in them for years.
They
Or
maybe
they
have
never
never
did.
had it.
Yeah.
Never did.
Yeah. But there,
And
I
there
mean,
is one in Green River.
And there are new turbine technologies that
Yeah.
bring in new types of blade designs and capacitors and
We've
all
had-
sorts
We
of
just
things.
had a
that are
guy
going-
talking
James
about
Perkins
exactly
came
that.
down from Little Green Hydro, and he you know what he talks about is situations where you have a high input and a low output, and the difference in height there will require only a very small amount of water to go through to produce power. And his systems are built in such a way that even the tiniest fish can't get into it. So it's you know, again, we're talking about, I think what we're talking about is distributed power, and it's really hard for people to wrap their minds around the fact that hydro does not mean the Hoover Dam.
Right.
And it can,
It can be a turbine this
little-
big, a little.
Yeah.
I think they
That's-
call it
that's
water
what-
water baby. I think.
yeah,
they
that's
call it.
what he had. He had a turbine that was in a box, and you know, standing next to it, you hear but you know, again with solar, if everybody in the United States had say 4 kilowatts, which is not a huge
Right,
amount,
that's a good size system.
it would be a good sized system. But if everybody had that, we'd have more solar than we could possibly use.
But even in Brattleboro, we have Price Chopper, Hannaford's, the
Right.
old Home Depot building, Staples, you know, all those buildings,
With flat
flat
roofs.
roofs.
And nobody would even see it really.
Look at Main Street. Look at all the
All
Main
the flat
Street.
roofs on Main
all
Street.
flat roofs on Main Street. Now the problem with that, of course, is that some of those roofs are not in very good shape.
Right.
But as the roofs get fixed up and rebuilt and so forth, it would make perfect sense to take advantage of that to put in solar on the roof.
What's wonderful about all this discussion is that these things are going to happen, whether we talk about them or not.
Yes,
whether we
that's true.
plan for them or not.
Well,
because
yeah.
It just makes sense. It's just
Every week
gonna occur to
somewhere
somebody.
it breaks
Yeah.
that some major large company has just embarked on a program. I just read one. I've actually got it because my nephew works for Mars. You know, he makes M&Ms or something like that. And Mars has just entered into a contract with an outfit in Texas to provide, all the power that Mars needs
Wow.
throughout the country.
From wind.
From when?
Yeah.
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 The other thing I wanted to mention is I read an article in one of the solar magazines that it's something like, you know, they talk about the labor and, you know, the labor market and there's no jobs and all this. Apparently, in the last several years, the renewables market jobs have increased about 30% a year.
Yeah.
And that's
It's
in
huge.
installation, retail,
Huge.
you know, design, engineering,
Yeah.
manufacturing.
It is the
big
fastest growing segment of our economy
And
right now.
It
And they're
needs
not
to be.
minimum wage jobs.
No.
And it needs to be because if you're aware of how much solar and how much wind needs to be deployed every minute in order to meet the goals that are required to keep the planet temperature at around 2%.
Now, I want to tell you, Dave, and I've said this many, many times, when people ask me, are we going to reach 90% by 2050? My answer
We're
is
gonna beat it.
no. We're going to reach 90.
I like
We're going to reach 95% by
right.
2035
Yeah.
because we haven't even begun to see the development going on in here. This is one of the reasons that I like your business design, the plan so much, because it really puts puts the source of the power generation at the community level, which is where I believe it belongs. And we're in a democracy here, and it happens that power is getting very